The request hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Even before Elian finished explaining the idea, he could see the hesitation on every face in the small conference room. "It's not experimental treatment," Elian said calmly. "I'm not asking to change your medical care. I only want permission to use a structured sensory routine while she's receiving normal nursing care." One of the neurologists folded her arms. "Based on what evidence?" "It's something I learned during trauma education with military instructors. Familiar command patterns and controlled sensory cues can sometimes help stimulate patients who have strong emotional or procedural memories." Another physician shook his head. "Sometimes is not a medical guideline." "I know," Elian replied. "That's why I'm asking to do it only if everyone agrees it's safe." The room became quiet. Finally, the senior attending physician spoke. "It won't interfere with medication or monitoring?" "No." "It won't replace therapy?" "Absolutely not." The physician looked around the table before nodding once. "Then you may try it. Carefully. We document everything." Elian thanked him without showing much emotion, but relief settled across his face. Later that afternoon, he entered the hospital room carrying nothing except a clipboard. Admiral Ronan looked up immediately. "They approved it?" "They approved a simple sensory routine," Elian answered. "No promises. No expectations." Ronan stood slowly. "If there's even a chance." Elian nodded. "I understand." The room stayed quiet for a moment before Elian moved beside the bed. He lowered the lights slightly to reduce distractions. He checked the monitors once more. Everything remained stable. Then he spoke. His voice was steady, calm, and measured. "Listen for my voice." He paused. "Focus." Another pause. "Breathe." Each word came with the same rhythm. No rush. No dramatic tone. Only consistency. He lightly tapped 2 fingers against the edge of the mattress in a slow pattern. Tap, tap, pause, tap. It was the same controlled timing he remembered from the military training demonstration years ago. Ronan watched silently from the corner. Nothing happened. Elian repeated the sequence. "Listen. Tap. Focus. Tap. Breathe." The monitors continued their steady rhythm. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Still nothing. Finally, Elian stopped. He made careful notes in the chart before looking toward Ronan. "I'm sorry." The Admiral forced a small smile. "You showed up. That's all I could do today." The next morning, Elian returned. The routine began again. Same words, same rhythm, same careful timing. A respiratory therapist quietly worked around them without interrupting. Another nurse passed through the room, offering a curious glance before continuing her rounds. By the 3rd session, several staff members had started paying attention, not because they expected results, because Elian never changed his approach. Every movement remained calm. Every word remained identical. There was something reassuring about the consistency. Late that afternoon, a young physical therapist entered just as Elian reached the final command. "Focus. Tap. Breathe." The therapist suddenly looked toward the patient's right hand. "Wait." Elian stopped. "What did you see?" "I think her thumb moved." Ronan was already standing beside the bed. Everyone stared. Nothing. Several seconds passed. Then the thumb moved again. Only a fraction. Small enough that someone looking away would have missed it. The therapist looked at Elian. "That wasn't random." Elian stepped closer. "Can you do that again?" He repeated the sequence. "Listen. Tap. Focus. Tap. Breathe." This time there was no movement. The room fell silent. The therapist glanced toward Ronan. "I know what I saw." "So do I," Ronan whispered. Within an hour, the neurology team ordered additional monitoring. Extra sensors were attached. Brain activity was recorded throughout the evening. Everyone waited. When the first report arrived, one of the physicians frowned. "Interesting." Another doctor leaned closer to the screen. "There are subtle changes." "Compared to yesterday?" "Yes." "Were they present before today's sessions?" "No." The room filled with cautious conversation. No one claimed the routine had caused the changes. No one dismissed them either. Word quietly spread across the intensive care unit, not as a miracle, simply as something unusual. During the next shift, nurses began stopping by room 418 a little more often. Some asked polite questions. Others simply watched for a few moments before leaving. Elliot answered every question the same way. We don't know if it's connected. He refused to build false hope. That honesty earned respect. Later that evening, Ronan sat beside his daughter while Elian prepared another session. I've spent my whole career believing every mission had a plan, Ronan said quietly. And now I'm learning patience. Elian offered a faint smile. Sometimes that's the hardest assignment. The session continued. The familiar words filled the quiet room. Listen. Tap. Focus. Tap. Breathe. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then her heartbeat increased slightly. Not dangerously. Just enough for the monitor to alert. A nurse immediately checked every reading. Blood pressure's fine. Oxygen is stable. The neurologist reviewed the monitor. No distress. Ronan looked toward Elian. Does that mean? It means we keep observing. Hope had entered the room, but nobody trusted it yet. Just before midnight, the hospital settled into its usual nighttime silence. Rain tapped softly against windows. Most visitors had gone home. Only staff remained moving through dim hallways. Then an alarm sounded from room 418. Nurses rushed inside. The monitor displayed sudden changes. Blood pressure had dropped. Her breathing patterns shifted. Doctors were called immediately. Elian stepped back as the team worked with practiced speed. Medication was adjusted. New scans were ordered. The room filled with controlled urgency. Ronan stood frozen near the doorway. No one could tell him what had caused the sudden decline. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the attending physician stepped outside. Before entering, "Good morning, Admiral." Ronan looked up. "Morning." Elian stepped inside, washed his hands, and began his routine with calm precision. He checked medications, adjusted blankets, and measured vital signs. Every movement seemed practiced, but never rushed. "You've been here all night again," Elian said. "I wasn't sleeping much at home anyway." Elian gave a small nod. "I'll bring fresh coffee in a few minutes." "You don't have to." "I know." He finished checking the monitors before looking at the patient herself. There was something different about the room today. Not obvious, just a feeling. As he gently lifted her wrist to check circulation, he paused for half a second. Then he let go. Maybe nothing. He continued working. A respiratory therapist entered, completed an assessment, and left after exchanging a few quiet words. Everything appeared normal. Still, Elian couldn't shake the feeling that he'd missed something. Later that afternoon, another physician reviewed the neurological exam. No meaningful response, she said while writing notes on her tablet. Ronan lowered his eyes. "Thank you, doctor." After she left, silence returned once more. Hours passed. Visitors came and went throughout neighboring rooms. Evening slowly replaced daylight. When the night shift officially began, the hospital grew calmer. The hallway lights dimmed. Footsteps became less frequent. Machines seemed louder. Elian returned carrying fresh linens. As he replaced a blanket, he spoke softly, not expecting an answer. "You're getting excellent care. Everyone's rooting for you." He adjusted the blanket near her shoulder. Then it happened. Her index finger twitched. Barely. Just once. Elian froze. He looked directly at her hand. Nothing. He waited another few seconds. Still nothing. He glanced toward the monitor. Every reading remained unchanged. "Did you see that?" he quietly asked. Ronan looked up from the chair. "See what?" "I thought." Elian stopped himself. He didn't want to offer hope based on something uncertain. "I may have imagined it." Ronan immediately stood. "What'd you think you saw?" "A finger movement." Ronan stared at his daughter's hand. Neither man spoke. Almost a full minute passed. Nothing happened. Finally, Ronan exhaled slowly. Probably just a reflex. Maybe. But Elian wasn't convinced. Later that night, after finishing his charting, he opened the patient's background file again. Military family. Raised on naval bases. Years spent around service members. Volunteer work with veteran rehabilitation programs. He kept reading. Then one line caught his attention. Years earlier, during a military resilience workshop for families, she had participated in structured sensory conditioning exercises developed from survival training principles. Elian leaned back. A memory surfaced from his own emergency trauma education. One instructor, a former military medic, had spoken about familiar command patterns helping certain patients remain mentally engaged during extreme stress. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't standard treatment for coma patients. But the idea had stayed with him. He closed the file and looked through the small window into room 418. The Admiral still sat beside the bed, still waiting, still refusing to leave. Elian knew what he was thinking. The question wasn't whether the technique would work. The question was whether anyone would even let him try. Morning arrived with more questions than answers. The crisis during the night had shaken everyone's confidence. The medical team had stabilized the Admiral's daughter, but no one could explain why her condition had suddenly changed. The scans showed no major new damage. Her vital signs slowly returned to where they had been before. Even so, the atmosphere outside room 418 felt different. Nurses spoke more quietly. Doctors reviewed every note twice. Hope had been replaced by careful caution. The attending physician gathered the team for another discussion. At this point, we have no evidence that the sensory routine caused a setback, she said. We also have no proof that it helped. Our priority remains her medical stability. Several doctors agreed. One suggested stopping the routine completely. Before anyone made a final decision, Elian spoke. If we stop now, we may never know whether those responses meant something. I'm not asking for more time without supervision. I'm asking for one more carefully monitored session. The physician looked around the room before giving a slow nod. One session. Every response is documented. Ronan waited outside until the meeting ended. He studied each face as the doctors walked away. When Elian finally stepped into the hallway, the Admiral asked only one question. Are they giving up? Elian shook his head. No, they're being careful. Ronan looked through the window at his daughter. Careful feels a lot like giving up when you're standing on this side of the glass. Elian didn't argue. Instead, he quietly replied, sometimes the hardest thing in medicine is knowing when to keep trying without promising an outcome. Later that morning, while reviewing older hospital records and family information, Elian found something that had received little attention before. Years earlier, the Admiral's daughter had attended a military family resilience program designed for children growing up around active duty service members. The notes mentioned structured exercises built around focus, breathing, rhythm, and verbal commands. They were not combat drills. They were simple routines meant to help children remain calm during stressful situations. Elian stared at the page for several moments. The pattern looked surprisingly familiar. He carried the file to Ronan's waiting area. Can I ask you something? Ronan nodded. Elian placed the folder on the table. Did you ever practice these exercises with your daughter? The Admiral's expression changed immediately. He sat down without saying a word. After several long seconds, he gave a quiet laugh that sounded more like regret than happiness. Every Saturday morning, he said softly, she used to think they were games. The memories returned one after another. Ronan remembered taking his young daughter to a nearby park before sunrise. He would clap a steady rhythm and tell her, listen, focus, breathe. She would roll her eyes, laugh, and copy every movement. Sometimes she complained that her friends got to sleep and while she was practicing Navy games. But she always came back the next weekend. After every session, they stopped for pancakes at a little diner near the base. Those mornings had become their special tradition, even during years when deployments kept them apart for months. I almost forgot about those days, Ronan admitted quietly. After she became an adult, we never talked about them again. Elian listened without interrupting. Those words weren't just training, the Admiral continued. They were ours. Nobody else used them exactly that way. For the first time since the accident, Ronan wondered if the routine wasn't reaching his daughter's body first. Maybe it was reaching memories buried somewhere deep inside her mind. That afternoon, the medical team agreed to slightly adjust the sensory routine. Nothing about the medical treatment changed. The medication stayed the same. The monitoring remained constant. The only difference was that Elliot now used the exact rhythm Ronan described from those Saturday mornings. Standing beside the bed, he spoke calmly. "Listen." A gentle tap followed. "Focus." Another tap. "Breathe." Ronan quietly repeated the final word from the chair beside the bed, his voice almost breaking. Several staff members watched through the doorway without speaking. Minutes passed. The monitors remained steady. No one expected an immediate change. Then the bedside therapist leaned forward. "Hold on," she whispered. A tiny tear slowly formed at the corner of the patient's closed eye. It didn't happen because of pain. Her facial muscles stayed relaxed. Another tear followed only seconds later. Ronan stood so quickly that his chair slid backward across the floor. "Did you see that?" he asked, hardly able to breathe. The neurologist stepped closer, examining every monitor before looking at the patient's face. "Her vital signs are stable," she said. "There's no sign of distress." Ronan gently took his daughter's hand, without saying another word. The tear remained on her cheek. She still hadn't opened her eyes. She still hadn't spoken. But for the first time since the accident, it felt as though someone trapped behind a locked door had finally found a way to knock from the inside. The tear changed everything, yet it proved nothing. By the next morning, every doctor involved in her care had read the overnight notes. Some believed the tear was an emotional response. Others thought it could have been an automatic physical reaction. No one wanted to jump to conclusions. Still, there was one fact they all agreed on. Something had changed. The room no longer felt like a place where nothing ever happened. Every nurse who walked in looked a little more closely at the patient than before. The sensory sessions continued under careful supervision. Elliot never rushed them. He never changed the pace or added anything dramatic. Each session began the same way. "Listen." A gentle pause. "Focus." Another pause. "Breathe." Ronan remained beside the bed every time, repeating the final word in a calm voice. The doctors recorded brain activity, heart rate, and every visible response. Most sessions ended quietly, but no one complained. Even the smallest change now mattered. Late that afternoon, while Elian finished another session, something unexpected happened. Ronan was holding his daughter's hand when he felt the slightest pressure against his fingers. At first, he thought he had imagined it. He looked down and waited without speaking. A few seconds later, her hand tightened again. It lasted only a moment before relaxing. Ronan's eyes filled with tears. "She squeezed my hand," he whispered. Elian stepped closer, but stayed calm. "Let's not move too quickly," he said softly. The nearby nurse called a neurologist, who arrived within moments. The doctor repeated a series of simple neurological checks. "Can you hear my voice?" she asked gently. There was no movement. She waited and tried again. Nothing happened. Ronan's daughter remained completely still. The doctor wrote several notes before looking at the Admiral. "The hand movement was real," she said, "but we can't say yet whether it was purposeful." Ronan nodded. Even though he wanted certainty, he understood why the doctors refused to promise more than the evidence allowed. Not everyone on the medical team believed the military routine had anything to do with the recent changes. During a staff meeting, one physician quietly shared a different opinion. Patients sometimes begin showing small signs of recovery without a clear reason. We should be careful not to connect unrelated events. Another doctor agreed. Recovery from brain injury rarely follows a straight path. Elian listened without becoming defensive. When someone asked for his opinion, he answered simply, whether the routine matters or not, the patient deserves patience. That's something we can all agree on. The room became silent for a moment before several heads nodded. That evening, the hospital grew unusually peaceful. Rain clouds had cleared and warm light from the setting sun reached through the windows of room 418. Ronan sat beside his daughter, as he had every day since the accident. For the first time in years, he spoke without sounding like a military commander. "I spent so much time teaching you to be strong," he said quietly. "I forgot to tell you how proud I was. I thought you already knew." His voice trembled. "If you come back, we don't have to talk about work anymore. We can talk about anything you want." We can start over. Elian stood near the doorway, giving the Admiral privacy while keeping an eye on the monitors. The room remained quiet except for the soft rhythm of equipment. Minutes passed without any visible change. Then one of the monitors displayed a gradual increase in neurological activity. It wasn't an alarm. It wasn't dangerous. The pattern was simply stronger than it had been during previous sessions. The nurse looked at the screen, then called a neurologist. Within minutes, several members of the medical team gathered around the monitor. The neurologist carefully compared the readings with earlier records. "This is the strongest activity we've seen since you arrived," she said. No one celebrated. Everyone understood that brain activity alone did not guarantee consciousness. Even so, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Hope returned, not because anyone had promised a miracle, but because the numbers finally matched the small changes everyone had been witnessing over the past several days. Ronan remained beside the bed, gently holding his daughter's hand. Elian prepared to end the evening session, believing she needed rest after the encouraging results. He quietly spoke the familiar words one final time. "Listen." A pause. "Focus." Another pause. "Breathe." For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then the patient's eyelids trembled ever so slightly. Every person in the room froze. The movement stopped almost as quickly as it had begun, leaving everyone staring in complete silence, wondering if the moment they had been waiting for was finally about to arrive. Her eyelids trembled again, and this time everyone in the room saw it. No one spoke. The monitors continued their quiet rhythm as the neurologist stepped closer to the bed. She gently shined a small light into the patient's eyes and watched carefully. "Stay calm," she told the staff. "Let's give her time." Ronan stood beside the bed with both hands trembling. He had imagined this moment every day since the accident, yet now that it was happening, he could barely breathe. Several long seconds passed before her eyes slowly opened. At first they seemed unfocused, drifting toward the ceiling lights. She blinked once, then again, as if trying to understand where she was. The room remained completely still. Elian stayed near the foot of the bed, allowing the doctors to complete their assessment. The neurologist spoke softly. "Can you hear me?" There was no answer, but her eyes shifted toward the sound of the doctor's voice. It was the first clear sign that she was aware of her surroundings. Ronan leaned forward carefully. He didn't want to overwhelm her. His voice was quiet, almost the same as it had been during the childhood exercises years ago. "You're safe," he said. "Take your time." She looked toward him without speaking. Her expression showed confusion more than recognition. The accident, the hospital, and the passing days had all disappeared from her memory. The doctors explained that this was common after serious brain injury. Recovery often happened one small step at a time. Elian watched silently before speaking the same familiar words one last time. "Listen." He waited a moment. "Focus." Another pause followed. "Breathe." As soon as she heard the final word, her eyes settled on her father. Something changed in her expression. The confusion slowly gave way to recognition. Her lips moved slightly before any sound came out. Finally, in a weak whisper, she managed to say one word. "Dad." Ronan closed his eyes as tears rolled down his face. He gently held her hand, careful not to squeeze too tightly. "I'm here," he answered. "I'm not going anywhere." Over the next several days, the hospital room slowly became brighter in every sense. The ventilator was removed when she could breathe on her own. Physical therapists helped her sit up for short periods. Speech therapists worked patiently as she regained her strength. Progress came in small victories rather than dramatic leaps. One day, she could lift her hand. Another day, she remembered the names of her childhood friends. Every improvement reminded everyone that healing was a journey, not a single moment. The doctors later met with Ronan and explained their findings. "There isn't one event that explains a recovery," the neurologist said. "Her surgeries, medication, rehabilitation, time, and the support around her all played important roles. The sensory routine may have helped stimulate familiar memories, but we cannot say it alone caused her awakening." Ronan appreciated the honesty. He had spent enough years in the military to understand that real life rarely offered simple answers. Sometimes success came from many people doing their jobs with patience and care. News of the remarkable recovery quietly spread through the hospital. Staff members congratulated one another, but Elian avoided attention whenever possible. When another nurse praised him in the hallway, he simply smiled. "Every patient deserves someone who refuses to stop caring," he said. "That's what matters." He returned to his regular duties without asking for recognition. To him, the greatest reward had already happened. A daughter had opened her eyes, and a father had been given another chance. Before leaving the hospital weeks later, Ronan found Elian finishing paperwork at the nurse's station. He extended his hand. "I've received medals during my career," the Admiral said. "None of them mean as much to me as being able to thank you today." Elian shook his hand with quiet respect. "You gave her something I couldn't," he replied. "Your voice carried memories that medicine alone couldn't provide." Ronan smiled. "Maybe we both did our part." The day she was discharged, father and daughter walked slowly through the hospital entrance together. She still needed therapy, and there would be challenges ahead, but she was smiling. As they reached the parking lot, she looked at her father and laughed softly. "When I'm stronger," she said, "we're going back to that little diner." Ronan smiled through happy tears. "For pancakes." She nodded. "And afterward, you can teach me those old exercises again. This time we do them together." As they drove away, Elian watched from a hospital window before quietly returning to care for the next patient, carrying with him the simple belief that hope often begins with patience, compassion, and the courage to keep showing up when no one else can see the difference.